This is a man who, in an act of compassion, rescued an abandoned mare from a snowstorm, not knowing that this gesture would make him the sole protector of the creature his entire town had sworn to destroy. The courage to defend those whom no one else will protect is what defines a true hero. If you believe this man did the right thing, subscribe so you don't miss the conclusion of this battle, which is just beginning. The wind of the Sierra Madre howled like a hungry spirit, tearing veils of snow from the landscape and casting them against the solitary figure moving with stubborn determination. Itzae, a man who seemed to have been carved by the very suffering of those mountains, felt the cold penetrate to his bones. But his grip on the rope of the improvised travois did not loosen. Each step was a battle against the deep snow that threatened to swallow him, a Herculean effort to drag his burden. Upon the structure of branches and leather, wrapped in furs, lay an unconscious body. It was not one of his own. It was a stranger, an enemy whose presence there under his protection defied all logic and instinct that had kept him alive to that day. The frigid air burned his lungs, but he continued on, an anonymous ghost in an infinite white world. Suddenly, a sound cut through the monotony of the storm, the sharp crack of a branch breaking under an unseen weight. Itzae stopped, his entire body tense, becoming a statue of alertness in the midst of the white chaos. His eyes, accustomed to deciphering the subtlest languages of nature, scanned the curtain of snow before him. Instinctively, his hand moved to cover the glint of a brass button protruding from the wounded man's furs, a small detail of a Mexican military uniform that screamed danger. A flash of ancestral hatred shone in his eyes, a flame he struggled to extinguish. That man represented the destruction of his world, the loss of his family, the reason for his exile. And yet, here he was, protecting him with his own life, cursed by a choice that had put him at war with himself. From the milky haze that surrounded him, a silhouette emerged, not that of a wolf or another soldier, but something larger, panting, a mare. Her brown coat was covered in ice, her swollen and trembling flank revealed an advanced pregnancy, and her large, dark eyes pleaded for something the storm had stolen, a refuge. The animal was exhausted, on the verge of collapse, and instinctively sought another form of life in the white desert. The hatred in Itzae's chest receded, replaced by a harsh, ancient compassion, a respect for life that refused to yield to nature's fury. Itzae cursed in silence. The spirits were mocking him, placing in his path not only the life of his enemy, but also that of an innocent creature and her unborn offspring. It was too heavy a burden. However, abandoning that life about to give birth to another was a cruelty that not even his hardened heart could commit. With a slow gesture, so as not to frighten the animal, he held the travois rope with one hand and extended the other to the mare. He needed to find shelter, and fast. His hunter's memory scanned the terrain invisible beneath the snow, searching for the recollection of a rock ledge, a small cave that could protect them from the wind's wrath. The survival of one had become the survival of all. Guided by a map etched into his soul, Itzae fought against the disorientation of the blizzard. The wind shifted, whispering secrets in his ears, and he followed it, feeling the slope of the ground beneath his feet, the texture of the snow subtly changing near rock formations. The mare followed him closely, her warm breath forming clouds of vapor that dissipated instantly, a ghostly presence at his heels. After what seemed like an eternity, his outstretched fingers met the cold, rough surface of a stone. He had found it, a crevice in the mountain, no bigger than a bear's den, but deep enough to break the relentless force of the wind. With one last monumental effort, he dragged the travois into the protective darkness, and the mare, without hesitation, squeezed into the tight space behind him, her trembling body finally finding relief from the incessant assault. Once inside, the roar of the storm was reduced to a distant murmur. The silence was heavy, filled only by the harsh breathing of the three beings. Itzae acted with the efficiency of one who lives on the edge. Using his flint and a bit of dry bark he kept in a leather pouch, he managed to light a small, stubborn flame. The fire cast a spectral dance of shadows on the cave wall, illuminating the pale, feverish face of the soldier and the heaving flank of the mare. It was then that he heard it. A low, guttural moan, not from the man, but from the animal. The mare's eyes were glazed with pain, and her body contracted violently. The time he thought he had bought was running out faster than the snow piling up outside. The foal was on its way, and he was the only help its mother would have in that fragile refuge in the heart of winter. Itzae's hands, calloused by violence and survival, moved with a gentleness he himself did not know he possessed. Leaving the soldier to his fever, he knelt on the cold earth beside the mare, murmuring soft words in his native tongue, sounds that were more a prayer to the land than an instruction. He was a hunter, not a midwife, but he knew the rhythms of life and death. With the patience of one who waits for prey, for days he watched, cleaned and guided, the small space of the cave filled with the sound of the animal's effort and the metallic, primordial scent of birth. Finally, with a last shuddering breath, a small, trembling foal slid into the world, a bundle of long legs and wet fur. Itzae cut the cord with his knife and, using a piece of soft fur, cleared the newborn's nostrils, which gasped and took its first breath of the cold mountain air. For an instant, the hatred that drove him was forgotten, replaced by the raw wonder of a new life, stubbornly existing against all odds. As the exhausted mare began to lick her offspring, Itzae felt a strange peace. That small refuge, sheltering an enemy, a mother and a newborn, seemed a world apart, a sanctuary against the fury of the storm and of his own heart. He ran his hand along the mare's flank, a gesture of respect, and it was then that he felt it. Beneath the layer of dirty, frozen fur, a raised mark. He pulled an ember from the fire for more light, pushing aside the animal's hair. The orange glow illuminated a symbol branded into the skin, a stylized sun with a ray that turned into a whip. The air fled his lungs as if he had been punched. That was the brand of El Látigo del Sol, the hacienda of Colonel Alcázar, the man who had ordered the massacre of his village. A wave of fury blinded him, and he turned to the soldier, the representative of everything he hated. It was then that the man, in his feverish delirium, turned, and his military shirt fell open, exposing his chest. There, on the same pale flesh, branded forever over his heart, was the same sun with the whip. That man was not just a soldier. He belonged to Alcázar in a much deeper and more terrible way. This brutal revelation, which ties the fate of an enemy to an innocent life with the same branding iron of the past, leaves us breathless. If you also felt the weight of this discovery, subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. The hatred was a hot poison that rose in Itzae's throat, suffocating the wonder of the previous moment. The same blade that minutes before had served life, cutting the cord that connected the foal to its mother, now weighed in his hand with a deadly purpose. He rose, a predatory shadow cast by the flickering fire, and the small space of the cave seemed to shrink with the intensity of his fury. Every fiber of his being screamed for revenge, to plunge that steel into the marked heart of the sleeping man, oblivious to his fate. But as his knee touched the ground beside the man, a fragile sound stopped him. The foal, trying to steady itself on its wobbly legs, let out a small whinny, a thread of innocent sound in the charged stillness. The mare lifted her head, her dark eyes fixed on him, not with fear, but with a primal trust he had just earned. To kill him there in that makeshift sanctuary would be to desecrate not only the birth, but the very choice that had led him to that point. The fury in his chest did not die. It transformed. The liquid blind fire solidified into a cutting ice, a terrible clarity. That man was no longer a simple enemy to be eliminated. The brand on his chest turned him into something infinitely more valuable. A link, a key to the darkness that had swallowed his past. Who was he to deserve Alcazar's personal brand? Why was he alone and wounded in the storm? The answers to those questions were worth more than blood spilled hastily on the cold earth. Killing him would be a quick, unsatisfying end. Keeping him alive was the beginning of a revenge he had never dared to dream of. With a new, cold determination, Itzae dipped a piece of cloth in the melted snow and began to wipe the soldier's feverish brow. He was no longer saving an enemy's life, he was preserving his weapon. Days and nights merged into a monotony of survival, punctuated only by the need to feed the fire and melt snow for the 3 prisoners of the cave. The enemy, the mare, and himself. Itzae worked with a grim efficiency, caring for the soldier not with compassion, but with the zeal of a craftsman sharpening his most precious tool. He cleaned and dressed the wound on his shoulder, a bullet hole, he realized, using moss to staunch the bleeding and a paste of chewed herbs to ward off infection. Every drop of water he forced between the man's cracked lips was an investment in his own future. The foal, oblivious to the tension that saturated the air, gained strength, its clumsy stumbles becoming steadier steps. The warmth from the animals' bodies was a physical comfort that contrasted violently with the coldness that had settled in Itzae's soul. Revenge was no longer a forest fire. It was the patient ice that, over time, cracks the hardest stone. It was at dawn, on what he judged to be the 3rd day, that the soldier finally awoke. It was not a sudden awakening, but a slow emergence from the feverish depths. A low moan, a frown under the pale light filtering through the cave entrance. The man's eyes opened, unfocused and confused, scanning the rock ceiling and the dancing shadows on the walls. Then they landed on Itzae, who was sitting on the other side of the fire, watching him in silence, his knife working methodically on a piece of wood. Panic flashed across the soldier's face. He tried to sit up, the sharp pain in his shoulder drawing a muffled cry from him. His free hand instinctively reached for the holster at his waist, only to find it empty. It was then that his eyes met Itzae's, and in the cold, inscrutable gaze of his captor, he saw neither savior nor enemy. He saw a judge, and he understood with terrifying clarity that the storm outside was the least of his worries. "Water!" The word came from the soldier's lips, a dry, cracked whisper. Itzae didn't move for a moment, finishing a precise cut on the wood he held. Then, slowly, he took a small clay bowl, filled it with water from the melted snow, and held it out to the man. The soldier drank greedily, water dribbling down his chin. His eyes, now clearer, darted from Itzae to the cave entrance, to the mare and the foal. "Who are you? Where are we?" he asked, his voice a little stronger, the authority of his training trying in vain to reassert itself. Itzae finished sharpening the point of his makeshift arrow and finally looked up. His voice, when it came, was as deep and rough as the stones around them, his Spanish thick with the accent of his lost tribe. "You are where the spirits wanted you to be, and you will speak when I command it." He leaned forward, the tip of his knife hovering inches from the man's chest. "Start with your name, and then tell me why the brand that belongs to Alcazar's cattle is burned into your skin." The blood drained from the soldier's face, leaving behind a deathly pallor that not even the fever could disguise. The panic in his eyes was no longer that of a lost man, but of a ghost who had just met his executioner. My name is Javier," he stammered, his body trembling despite the heat of the fire. He tried to pull away from the knife, but the pain in his shoulder paralyzed him with a groan. "The brand, it's nothing. It's a mark of loyalty." The lie was so weak, so transparent, that it hung in the air like smoke before dissipating. Itzae didn't get angry. He simply stood up, walked over to the mare, and ran his hand over the same brand on the animal's flank, who nuzzled confidently against him. He then looked back at Javier, his eyes black and unforgiving. Loyalty? Itzae repeated the word as if it were poison. The same loyalty he demands from his horses. You are his cattle, soldier, and now you are mine. And you will tell me every secret you carry under that brand, or you will wish the blizzard had devoured you. The terror broke through Javier's facade. A dry, humorless laugh escaped his lips, turning into a sob of despair. Cattle, he repeated, the word sounding like a death sentence. Yes, that's what we are. His feverish eyes fixed on an empty spot on the cave wall, as if seeing the ghosts of his past dancing in the shadows. I didn't enlist. I was born there. My mother was a servant in the main house. My father, no one knows. We weren't soldiers. We were property, branded like the horses and the cattle so everyone knew who we belonged to. The uniform, he looked at his torn tunic with deep disgust, is just a prettier collar. The truth poured out of him like a poison he had held in for too long. He had been running away. The bullet in his shoulder hadn't come from an enemy in battle, but from one of Alcazar's foremen, shooting to bring down an animal that had dared to escape its enclosure. Itzae listened to the confession without a single muscle in his face moving. He felt no compassion, no bond of shared suffering. What he felt was the cold satisfaction of a predator who has just understood the weakness of its prey. Javier's story didn't make him a brother in pain. It made him the perfect tool. A runaway slave knew the ways of the main house, the guards' routines, the master's weaknesses. Revenge, once a distant and unreachable mountain, now had a path traced to its summit. Slowly, Itzae retracted the knife and sheathed it. The gesture offered no relief, only a change in the nature of the threat. "So you weren't serving him," Itzae said, his voice a low growl. "You were running from him." He knelt, his face inches from Javier's, and the smell of smoke and snow filled the air between them. "Your escape ends here, but your journey does not. You have a choice, Javier. Die in this cave like a lost animal, or guide me back to your collar. You will show me how to enter the serpent's den. You will take me to Alcazar." Itzae's question was not an offer, but the weight of two different tombstones. Javier looked at the implacable face of his captor, then at the dancing fire, and finally his eyes rested on the mare and the foal. The newborn creature, ignorant of the brand its mother carried, was trying to nurse, a symbol of innocent life in the midst of a death pact. To return to the hacienda was to return to torture and certain execution. But to die there, in the cold, his body left for the wolves, was to disappear without a trace, as if his miserable life had never existed. A bitter irony took hold of him. The only person offering him a chance to live another day was the man who had every reason to kill him. The terror of Alcazar was a living flame in his memory, but the instinct for survival was a deeper, older river. With a tremor that shook his wounded body, Javier closed his eyes and gave the only answer he could. A slow, defeated nod. The storm subsided during the night. The furious howl of the wind was replaced by a deep, heavy silence, the silence of a world buried under a shroud of fresh snow. With Javier's surrender, the atmosphere in the cave had also changed. The tension of the imminent threat dissipated, giving way to a functional, somber stillness. Itzae offered no words of comfort or triumph. He simply accepted Javier's nod like a hunter confirming his trap had worked. He moved with a renewed purpose, dividing the last of his dried meat, a piece for himself and one for Javier, not as an act of generosity, but as one who fuels a tool before a difficult job. Outside the cave, the first rays of a pale, watery sun pierced the clouds, reflecting in a blinding glare on the white, untouched landscape. The path south, the path back to hell, was now visible. The unholy alliance was sealed, and their journey was about to begin. Itzae wasted no time with words. The world outside, remade in white and silence, demanded action. not debate. Before they left, he examined Javier's shoulder with dispassionate efficiency, cleaning the wound again and tying a new makeshift bandage with a leather strip to maintain pressure. The soldier winced in pain, but remained silent, understanding that Itzae's attention was a matter of necessity, not mercy. Afterward, Itzae helped him mount the mare. The animal, though still weak, bore the weight with a patient snort. The foal, a bundle of unstable legs, nestled nervously against its mother's flank. As they left the shelter of the rock, the sunlight reflecting on the snow was blinding, forcing them to squint. They were an unlikely and fragile caravan, a warrior driven by hatred, a wounded slave returning to his captivity, a mother and her offspring, both branded by the same tyrant. Their progress was painfully slow. The foal stumbled every few steps in the deep snow, and the mare would patiently stop for it to recover, her maternal instinct dictating the pace of their journey of vengeance. They walked in silence, a fragile truce maintained by mutual exhaustion and Itzae's singular purpose. He led the way, his eyes scanning the landscape not for beauty, but for danger and sustenance. Rabbit tracks, dry branches exposed by the wind, the subtle shape of the terrain beneath the white blanket. Javier, hunched in the saddle, was a haunted ghost, each step south an echo of his failed escape. He did not look at his guide. His feverish eyes were fixed on the distant horizon, where, invisible beyond the mountains, lay the hacienda that had been both his only home and his perpetual prison. Itzae's hatred was the engine of the journey, but it was Javier's terror that served as their compass. By nightfall, they found shelter, under the protection of a small pine grove whose snow-heavy branches touched the ground, forming a sort of natural grotto. Itzae moved with an economy of motion that bordered on ritual, gathering dry wood and starting a fire that crackled and spit sparks into the violet dusk. He offered Javier a piece of an edible root he had dug up during the walk, a gesture that held no warmth, only the cold logic of keeping his guide alive. Seated on opposite sides of the small fire, the silence between them was deeper than the snow. Javier watched Itzae, the man who moved through the landscape not as an intruder, but as a part of it, a force of nature as relentless as the winter. He saw the way Itzae calmed the mare with a low murmur, and how his eyes never stopped scanning the surrounding darkness, and he understood that he was not following a man, but a spectre of vengeance dragging him back to the tomb from which he had barely escaped. "Tell me about the hacienda." Itzae's voice cut through the night, devoid of any emotion. It wasn't a question, it was a command. Javier shuddered, looking away into the dancing flames. The words came out hesitantly at first, a wisp of smoke, then gained substance as the memories flooded him. He described not a fortress, but a cage. He spoke of the high walls, not to keep enemies out, but to keep those inside, in. He described the routine of the guards, more shepherds than soldiers, their schedules, their posts, their vices. He spoke of the main courtyard, where punishments were carried out for all to see, and of the secret tunnels beneath the main house used by the servants, which he, as the son of one, knew like the veins in his own body. Itzae listened in absolute silence, his face a mask of stone illuminated by the fire. Every word from Javier was a brick, and in Itzae's mind he was building the map of his enemy's destruction, using a slave's pain as mortar. "And the colonel?" Itzae's voice was an abrupt cut into Javier's narrative. "Where is the snake when he is not in the courtyard?" Javier swallowed hard, his gaze lost in the flames, as if he saw the man's face there. "He has a room, the trophy room. It's his sanctuary. Maps, old weapons, and things he took from villages like yours." The pause was heavy, laden with the weight of the unsaid. "He goes there every night after dinner, alone, to drink and remember his victories." Javier then leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, a spark of his own revenge igniting deep in his eyes. "The main tunnel from the kitchens as an old branch used to carry firewood, sealed up for years. It ends behind the stone fireplace in that very room. For the first time, a subtle change occurred in Itzae's expression. His eyes narrowed, not with hatred, but with an intense predatory calculation. The unreachable mountain of his revenge had just revealed a path. The days that followed transformed the landscape and the men. The deep snow of the mountains gave way to rocky hills and stubborn scrubland that fought to survive the cold. The silent alliance between Itzae and Javier solidified into a functional routine. Itzae hunted, Javier tended the fire. Itzae led, Javier navigated, pointing out forgotten landmarks that guided him back to his own pain. The foal, now with steadier legs, trotted alongside its mother, a promise of new life that contrasted with the deadly purpose of the journey. There were no more questions. Every step south was an affirmation of the pact made around that fire. Revenge had a name, a place, and now a way. Finally, they saw it. Nestled in a valley that cut through the arid plain, the Hacienda del Sol did not rise like a fortress, but spread out like a disease. A stain of white walls and red roofs, surrounded by adobe walls that seemed to suck the color from the very earth. To Javier, it was the sight of a familiar scar on his own soul. To Itzae, it was the beating heart of the poison that had killed his people. They found shelter in a time-eroded ravine, a perfect hiding spot that gave them a clear view of the main gate and the movement of the guards. From there, they watched the sun set, painting the sky in shades of blood and orange over their enemy's house. The mare and the foal, who had been symbols of an unlikely survival, were now a burden, an innocent reminder of life in a place where they planned only death. When the last sliver of light disappeared, and the first star pierced the velvet of the night, Itzae moved. He did not address Javier but the mare. In silence, he cut the rope he had used as a makeshift rein and ran his hand one last time over the brand on her flank, a gesture that was both a farewell and a promise. Then, with a firm slap, he startled her, sending her galloping away from the hacienda into the open hills, with her foal bouncing awkwardly behind her. Free. It was a mercy he could not grant himself. He then turned to Javier, whose eyes shone with a mixture of terror and a new, feverish hope. They needed no words. The night had come, bringing with it the cold and the silence that precedes the hunt, and two ghosts, each with their own demons, began to move toward the darkness of the serpent's den. They moved like shadows, detached from the night. Itzae, with the silent grace of a predator, seemed to merge with the terrain, his feet finding purchase without dislodging a single loose stone. Javier, on the other hand, moved with the stiffness of pain and fear, but his knowledge was a sharper weapon than Itzae's knife. He pointed not to the obvious paths, but to the hacienda's vulnerabilities, a deeper shadow cast by a wall, the blind spot between the roots of two distant sentinels whose occasional voices were carried by the wind like ghostly warnings. The cold air carried the smell of wood smoke and livestock, a domestic scent that contrasted violently with the murderous intent that drove them. They skirted the property to a section of the back wall where the vegetation grew wild and forgotten. There, hidden by a tangle of thorny vines, lay a rusty iron grate covering the dark mouth of an old drain. Javier pointed, his breath forming a white cloud in front of his face. This was the gateway to hell. Itzae did not hesitate. Using the tip of his knife and the strength of his shoulders, he forced the rusty grate, which gave way with a metallic groan that seemed to scream in the stillness of the night. A draught of cold, damp air, smelling of musty earth and old secrets, rose from the dark hole. Inside, the darkness was absolute, a different world where sight was worthless, and it was in this world that their roles reversed. Itzae, the master of the wilderness, became the follower. Javier, the trembling slave, became the guide. He entered first, moving with a certainty that came from a lifetime of fear and familiarity. His hands brushed against the stone walls, feeling the curves, the forks, and the pitfalls of a labyrinth only he knew. Itzae followed him closely, the muffled sound of their breaths and the occasional drip of water the only sounds in that sepulchral silence. With every step, they delved deeper into the bowels of the hacienda, moving beneath the feet of the men who would hunt and kill them if they knew of their presence, approaching, with terrible precision, the stone heart of the man they both wanted to see destroyed. Javier stopped abruptly, his hand flat against the damp wall. Itzae, right behind him, froze, his senses on high alert. For an instant, the only sound was a drop of water falling into a distant puddle, a lonely echo in the belly of the earth. Then Itzae heard what Javier had already noticed. Muffled sounds coming from above. The languid melody of a guitar, distant laughter, and the shuffle of heavy boots on a wooden floor. They were directly under one of the common areas, perhaps the guards' barracks. Javier didn't look back. He simply turned right, into a narrower, lower tunnel, where the air became thicker, heavy with the ancient smell of soot and cold ashes. There, the sound from the world above disappeared, replaced by a silence so profound Itzae could hear the blood pulsing in his own ears. After a few more meters, Javier stopped again and touched Itzae's shoulder, a signal to be quiet. He knelt and ran his hands over the floor and the wall, his fingers reading a language of stone and mortar that only he knew. "This is it." His voice was an almost inaudible breath. "The wall, it's different." Itzae knelt beside him. In the dark he couldn't see, but he could feel. The wall in front of him was indeed different, the bricks rougher and poorly set, the hasty work of someone sealing a forgotten path. He drew the knife from its sheath, the blade a sliver of cold steel in the darkness. Javier's plan was a map, but the execution was the hunter's art. With the tip of the knife, Itzae began to scrape away the dry, brittle mortar between two bricks. A slow, meticulous job that required infinite patience. Every scrape was a risk. Every grain of dust that fell seemed to sound like an avalanche. Time stretched, measured only by the slow erosion of the ancient cement. Finally, a brick loosened. Itzae pressed his ear to the opening, and the sound he heard froze his blood. The crackle of a fire and the distinct clink of glass against a bottle. The serpent was in its nest. With torturous slowness, he removed the brick, creating a dark slit. In the wall, a thin beam of golden light cut through the tunnel's darkness, revealing Javier's eye, wide and fixed on the opening, and through it, a glimpse of the trophy room and the polished boot of the man they both came to kill. With the patience of a spider weaving its web, Itzae removed a second brick and then a third, the mortar dust falling silently onto the dark tunnel floor. The sliver of light widened, becoming a window into the enemy's den. The smell of expensive brandy and cigar smoke invaded the musty air, odors of a power he only knew by the destruction it left in its wake. Inside, in a high-backed leather armchair facing the flames, sat Colonel Alcazar. They couldn't see his face, only the outline of his broad shoulders under a silk robe and the hand holding a crystal glass, lazily swirling the amber liquid. The room was a testament to his cruelty. The heads of deer and pumas hung alongside cracked tribal shields, broken spears, and, in a glass case, the ceremonial robes of a shaman. Itzae's gaze fixed on them, and the heat of vengeance in his chest turned to a cutting ice. Those were his grandfather's robes. Beside him, Javier trembled uncontrollably, not from cold, but from the primal terror of being so close to the monster that haunted his nightmares. The opening was now large enough. Itzae placed a hand on Javier's shoulder, a firm grip that was both a command to stay quiet and a silent acknowledgement of the end of their shared journey. Then, with a fluid and soundless movement, he slipped through the hole, his bare feet making no noise on the plush rug that covered the stone floor. He was a spectre emerging from the heart of the mountain, the firelight dancing on his skin, the knife in his hand absorbing the light. Alcázar, oblivious, let out a sigh of contentment and leaned forward to place another log on the fire. It was the last peaceful move he would ever make. Itzae crossed the room, moving past the relics of his people like a ghost, visiting his own desecrated grave. He stopped directly behind the armchair. He did not attack. He wanted the face, he wanted the eyes, he wanted the last sound Alcázar heard to be one that would drag him to hell. In a whisper that was rougher than the rustle of dry leaves, Itzae spoke a single word in the language of his people, the name of his massacred village. The colonel froze, the glass stopping halfway to his lips. Slowly he turned, his arrogant, satisfied face contorting into a mask of shock and disbelief. The serpent turned to face the ghost who had come to collect the debt. Alcázar's eyes, accustomed to seeing fear in others, widened as they met a cold, impenetrable void. For a fraction of a second, arrogance gave way to pure confusion. His mind struggled to process the impossible apparition. "A ghost!" he spat, his voice a trembling growl as he tried to regain his composure, his hand instinctively sliding toward an ornate pistol resting on the table beside his drink. "I thought we exterminated all of you." Itzae's reply was no more than a breath of cold air, but it carried the weight of an endless winter. "You did not exterminate the memories." Before Alcázar could even close his fingers around the gun, Itzae exploded into motion. It was not the advance of a man, but the pounce of a jaguar, a blur of contained fury that shot across the rug and slammed into the armchair. The gun flew away, skittering across the polished floor. The colonel, torn from his leather throne, fell backward with a choked cry of surprise and pain. The spectre of his ruin now upon him, the glint of the knife the only light in his terrified eyes. The fight was brief and ugly, devoid of any honor. It was the agony of a cornered beast against the efficiency of a predator. Alcázar's soft body was no match for Itzae's muscles of steel. The sound of a body hitting the glass case echoed through the room, shattering the sanctuary and causing the shaman's robes to fall over the scene, like a prophetic shroud. For an instant, their eyes met, and on the colonel's face there was no longer arrogance, only the abject terror of a man finally facing a debt he never believed would be collected. Then, with a hiss of steel, the knife that had given life to a foal in the snow fulfilled its final purpose. The silence that followed was heavier than the storm. Itzae stood, his chest heaving, not from exhaustion, but from an empty void where the fury had burned for so long. He ignored the body on the floor, walked to his grandfather's fallen robes, and picked them up with a reverence that contrasted with the violence of the moment. From the hole in the wall, Javier watched, trembling, at the fall of his god and his demon. Itzae turned, and his gaze met Javier's through the darkness of the tunnel, a silent acknowledgement that the hunt was finally over. Without a word, without a second glance at the fallen body, Itzae folded his grandfather's robes with the precision of a sacred ritual. That was his true trophy, the only thing in that room that had value. With the fabric in his arms, he retreated into the darkness of the tunnel, his movement as silent as his arrival. There, Javier remained crouched, a man of stone whose face was a canvas of terror and awe. Vengeance, which for him was an impossible dream, had just materialized in blood and shattered glass before his eyes. Itzae offered no words of comfort or victory. He just gave a nod, a mute command to retreat. It was the urgency in that gesture, the total absence of emotion, that broke Javier's spell and forced him to move, crawling backward, away from the room that had become a tomb and back into the bowels of the earth. They retraced their path in a heavy silence, each step away from the room, a step toward an unimaginable future. When they finally emerged from the rusty grate into the cold night air, the hacienda behind them seemed asleep, ignorant of its master's death. They moved away to the safety of a rocky outcrop, the pale moon bathing the landscape in silver. There Itzae stopped. He looked at Javier, the man who had been his key, and held out the knife, its worn wooden handle still warm. Javier hesitated, then took it, the steel heavy and real in his trembling hand. "Now, your path is your own," Itzae said, the only words exchanged since Alcazar's death. Without waiting for a reply, he turned, a solitary figure that began to walk north, back toward the heart of the mountains. Javier stayed behind, holding the blade that had freed him, and for the first time in his life he looked at the southern horizon, not as an escape route, but as a blank page. Javier remained motionless for a long time, the cold metal of the knife seeming to burn his palm. The weight of that blade was the weight of a lifetime of servitude, ended in an instant of cathartic violence. He looked to the south, to the world that stretched beyond the shadow of the hacienda. For the first time there were no walls, no foremen, no branding iron of Alcazar defining the limits of his existence. There was only the land, the night, and a freedom so vast and terrifying it left him breathless. Then a distant sound cut through the silence. The hurried ringing of a bell from the hacienda, a tardy alarm that was beginning to spread panic. That sound, which once would have paralyzed him with fear, now spurred him on. Without looking back, he tucked the knife into his waistband, both an amulet and a weapon, and began to run, not north like the ghost who had freed him, but south toward his blank page, a man reborn from fire and blood. Meanwhile, Itzae walked north with steady, measured steps. The burden of his grandfather's robes in his arms was a comforting weight, the only real thing in a world that had suddenly become too quiet. The fire of vengeance that had consumed him for so many years, that had guided him through the snow and sustained him in the darkness, had finally been extinguished, leaving behind not peace, but a deep and icy emptiness. Alcazar's death had not brought back his family, nor rebuilt his village. It was just an endpoint, the closing of a book written with pain. The full moon rose over the distant peaks of the Sierra Madre, bathing him in its silver light. He was no longer a hunter nor an avenger. He was just a man, the last guardian of a sacred memory, walking back home to bury his dead, and perhaps finally learn to live with his ghosts. The walk back was a pilgrimage through a purgatory of his own making. Each step north took him further from the smoke and blood, but closer to the ghosts that had driven his journey. The silence, once his ally in the hunt, was now an abyss that echoed the absence of his purpose. He clutched the bundle of robes to his chest, the rough fabric a tangible reminder of all that had been lost and why he had become a spectre. A lone eagle circled lazily in the cold blue sky, a sovereign indifferent to the stain of hatred he had left behind in the south. Nature did not care for revenge, only for continuity, and Itzae, for the first time in years, felt the crushing weight of being just a man, small and broken under the infinite sky. When his feet finally trod upon the ashes of his village, the emptiness in his chest found a home. The blackened structures were skeletons against the snow, the window holes empty eyes that stared at him in silent accusation. He did not cry. The tears had dried up long ago, replaced by ice. Instead, he climbed to the highest point of the ridge that protected the valley, where the council stone still stood, cracked by fire, but whole. There, under the gaze of the eagle and the spirits of his ancestors, he carefully unfolded his grandfather's robes. He did not bury them, for memories should not be hidden under the earth. He spread them over the snow, an impromptu altar to the rising sun, and began to sing, a low, guttural song, not of war or pain, but of remembrance. The sound, fragile in the vast silence, was the first thread of a new web, the first act of a guardian who no longer protected a hatred, but a story that refused to die. This transformation from vengeance to memory is the true end of this journey. If Itzae's story has also touched your heart, help it never to die by sharing this video and leave a comment about the power that lies in preserving a memory. Thank you for following this journey.